So, Phillip, let's start this conversation with the concept of rent seeking. I feel like over the past, 5 or 10 years, this concept has begun, has gotten a lot more prominence, not just in libertarian circles, but also in some liberal circles. Tell us what this concept of rent seeking is.
Well, it dates back to the 1970s when a guy named Gordon Tullock sort of came up with it. It's the idea that there's some forms of income that come not from the fact you might have built a better mousetrap or provided some honest labor, but rather because you got Congress or some other organ of government to create a rule that allows you to reap windfall profits, or rents in this case, as they're called. So an example might be if the government granted you a monopoly, said that, from now on, all ballpoint pens can only be made by you. You would therefore have no competition in the ballpoint pen market, and you could charge monopoly prices for for pens. And so that would be an idea of rent seeking. And that's a perfectly legitimate idea, that there are all kinds of ways that government does favors to corporations, for example, through a particular government policy that allows them to prevail over their competitors. In recent times, as you say, this concept has been expanded to the point that it's being used as a weapon against people that, little people who want to do things like improve their standard of living through securing some kind of occupational licensing, zoning, all kinds of other things that where it's misapplied these days.
All right, yeah, and before we get to that misapplication, contextualize for us, let's say, a drug patent, right? I mean, at one point, it is. There is maybe a practical justification for it, some type of payback. But then at another point, and I guess maybe this is temporal, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, then it does become more, I guess, rentier, if you will. I mean, just unpack that for us.
Well, that's a great example. A patent is a form of monopoly, right? It's a temporary monopoly that the government grants to an individual. Now, there's a positive case for why the government should do this in some instances. It is within bounds an incentive to innovation, right? If I'm going to go to all the trouble to invent some new, better mousetrap, it's good that I get rewarded for my efforts. And when I am rewarded, or people are rewarded for their innovation, presumably get more innovation. That's the thought behind why we need some patents, and that goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. There's nothing inherently evil about that idea. But if you extend patents so that they apply to things that they shouldn't apply to, like you're patenting things that are just found in nature, or you're extending the life of patents to many generations after you're dead, your heirs are still collecting on this patent that was granted to you, well, it's hard to argue anymore that that's serving any societal interests, and yet it is causing a redistribution of wealth to you, the patent holder. So that would be a classic example of rent seeking. A tariff can be another example, right? If the government passes a tariff, all of a sudden domestic producers have an advantage that they didn't have before and can charge higher prices than they could before because the government has eliminated much of their competition from abroad. So again, there may be positive reasons why society would benefit from having a particular tariff, or a nation would benefit from it, but it also can be abused in a way that's just crony capitalism. So rent seeking isn't good or bad in itself, but there are good examples of rent seeking and bad examples.
I mean, that's exactly where I wanted to get to. And I think to a large extent, that is a lot of what you're arguing in the context of the case for small business collusion. So, talk to us about, before you actually make that case, what does that mean? I mean, where do we see small business collusion before we assess whether it is something we want to encourage or not?
Mm-hmm. Well, a classic example of small business collusion would be a farmers co-op. So what is a farmers co-op? Farmers get together with each other and they form a collective or cooperative organization whereby they coordinate with each other on how much milk they're going to produce and what they're going to do with the milk, right? And they might build their own creamery and bake cheese and other dairy products. And by doing that, the farmers improve their lot in life because when they come to market with their milk, they're no longer just coming to market as individuals with this highly perishable product, trying to sell it to some large corporation on the other side of the negotiating table. They're coming together as a cooperative, as a whole bunch of people who have, in some sense, cornered a part of the milk production in some part of the world, and that improves their negotiating power against the big agro businesses that are buying the milk. So that's an ancient and much revered form of cooperative capitalism, and it involves collusion of a kind, right? It involves people conspiring with each other about what the level of production is going to be, what the level of what their price is going to be. So that's a form of good and positive collusion if you think that it's good that we have small-scale family farmers. So that's one example, right?
All right, let's talk about licensing. Is licensing like, dentists, or let's say, barbers? Is that a form of small business collusion? And if not, why?
Well, it can be, and it can be a good thing, right? If with licensing, in some instances, there's a clear public purpose served by having a licensing requirement to come into some particular occupation. So once upon a time, you didn't need to have a license to be a doctor, and we had lots of quack doctors, and there was a clear public interest in creating some credentialing system for doctors. Other cases get a little murkier on what the immediate public interest is. With plumbers, it's good that your plumber comes over and he knows what he's doing, so he doesn't cause a flood in your basement. With barbers, well, there's some public hygiene argument about why it'd be good for barbers to have minimal skill sets so they don't spread dandruff through the population, right? It also helps the consumer to know better, like, who to buy from, because it saves you time if you know that this barber's licensed. That tells you, without you having to do your own vetting, that this barber is like minimally competent to cut your hair. So that's good. But there's another form of licensing that's often criticized, which is like, well, we're just putting up this license requirement in order to limit the supply of barbers, or limit the supply of taxi drivers, or limit the supply of dog groomers, or something like that. And that is supposed to be, and some people are telling this example of egregious rent seeking, because what you're doing is you're using public policy to create a barrier to trade that allows you to make more money than you would otherwise, right? And part of what I argue in this piece I've just written for the Washington Monthly is actually not so fast. Some of the kind of collusion among working class people to raise their income is not really any different in kind than they're coming to form a union together. So if you think about, say, hair braiders, if hair braiders each individually petition their government to get a occupational licensing agreement such that you can't be a hair braider without having this license, and they therefore raise their income as hair braiders, that's supposed to be a bad thing in some people's telling. But if all these hair braiders work for a single corporation as employees, and they got together and created a plan. They conspired, colluded to form a union. No one would say, well, that's somehow illegitimate or will cause poverty or is, something is evil as something to be deplored. It's not. It's a union. But we have this weird
double standard in a way.
Frame in our head. Yeah, double standards, right? So we have
Philip,
a long history of. Go ahead.
Let's take a break right there. When we come back, we'll go forward as to just why that. What is at the basis of that double standard, and why we should push back against it. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'll be right back. I'm talking to Phillip Longman from the Washington Monthly on his case for small business collusion.